My next patron question is from the Cinematic Bandicoot, who want to know about the way authors view film adaptations of their work. When are authors allowed to be critical of films based on their books? It feels like a lot of them don't realize that film is a different medium and some changes are necessary when bringing their stories to the screen. For example, Roald Dahl hated every adaptation of his books except 1989's The BFG. Simultaneously, Dodie Smith loved Disney's adaptation of the 101 Dalmatians, while P.L. Travers despised his take on Mary Poppins. Then there are cases like Stephen King, who hated Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, but adored Rob Reiner's take on Misery. Occasionally, some authors like William Goldman and Gideon Defoe will pen the screenplay to their own adaptations, like The Princess Bride and The Pirates and Adventure with Scientists, but are authors allowed to be critical if they don't understand the differences in both mediums? I do find it interesting when authors end up disappointed or even outright annoyed by a film adaptation of one of their books. For me, when I see these sorts of cases, I try to look at it from the author's point of view. When they're writing a book, it's often a solitary endeavor with just them at their computer or typewriter. The publisher and editor will often chime in with some thoughts, and there are also writers like James Patterson, who use ghostwriters and co-authors, but for the most part, what you see in the book is one person's singular imagination and writing style. When the rights are sold to a production company or movie studio, there are then entire teams of people, like directors, screenwriters, producers, executives, actors, and several others providing input on how to tell that story. And some of them might latch onto a certain aspect of the book that the author did not, or remove elements they feel will not work in a film adaptation. Sometimes the author will approve of these changes, while others might disagree and feel it takes away from the story they came up with. A famous example of an author disliking how his book was adapted was Stephen King with The Shining. He based Jack Torrance largely on himself and the severe alcoholism he suffered from in the 70s and his fear of what he might do to his wife and children while inebriated. While a bit of that remained in Stanley Kubrick's adaptation, it was given less of a focus, much to King's annoyance. With The Shining being such a personal story for King, I can understand why that theme being downsized would upset him. He also viewed Jack as a sympathetic, tragic character who the Overlook Hotel forces to go down a dark path, while the Jack in Kubrick's film is portrayed a lot less sympathetically and more willing to join the ghosts of the hotel. Although he has softened his stance on the movie in the years since, and even allowed the Dr. Sleep film adaptation to include visuals and elements from the Kubrick movie, his initial disappointment clearly comes from a place of not agreeing with the changes to a story that is close to his heart. The question mentioned Roald Dahl's dislike for many of the film adaptations of his work, and an interesting case was with The Witches. When he was screened the initial cut of the film, he came away with a positive impression of the movie, especially the ending. It even made him cry. However, director Nicholas Roeg and executive producer Jim Henson decided to use a different, happier ending that departed from the book, which made Dahl furious. I find that decision strange too. They just saw the creator of the story move to tears by the ending, but then went, "No, we're not going to use that." A movie that I thought did a great job of showing the adaptation process from the point of view of the author is Saving Mr. Banks. Being a Disney-produced movie about the making of Mary Poppins, you might think it would take the approach of Walt was right about everything. After all, that movie went on to become an acclaimed multiple Oscar-winning blockbuster that's still beloved and cherished to this day. Saving Mr. Banks could have told the audience, what does that lady know? However, the filmmakers instead chose to have the film be about the relationship between an author and their work, and the difficulty of handing it off to others. The film provides a clear understanding of her attachment to the story she created, and why she refuses the changes proposed by Walt Disney and screenwriter Don DeGrady. In fact, if you read up on the real P.L. Travers, they actually softened her for the movie, and even though a big part of Saving Mr. Banks is Travers making it clear to Disney that the father is the emotional core of the story, Mr. Banks is barely even in the book, and that was an example of historical license taken by the filmmakers. Nonetheless, I think Saving Mr. Banks is able to show the closeness the authors have with their stories and the difficulties of the adaptation process. Now, you do have cases where authors appreciate changes from their books. When Billy Wilder made Double Indemnity, James Cain loved the changes made to his book and wished he'd come up with them himself. He thought the ending was much better and even praised the style of narration used for the main character. The adaptations of Cain's other books, like Mildred Pierce and The Postman Always Rings Twice, also altered a lot of things, but Double Indemnity was the only one where he said he preferred the adaptation choices, and he even went to see it multiple times in the theater. Gary K. Wolfe, the author of Who Censored Roger Rabbit, loved the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit so much that when he wrote a sequel book, he followed the events of the movie instead of the first book. To me, it's always interesting to see how the creator of the original story feels about the adaptation, and I think they're absolutely in their right to have criticisms. They created an entire world in their own heads, and seeing it adapted and having someone else interpret the story and themes will not always result in something they're satisfied with, and I understand that. Thank you for your questions, Cinematic Bandicoot.